Susanna Locke had catalogued 100 medicine cabinets, and none had ever frightened her the way this one did. Someone had shelved a bottle of oil of vitriol beside an open paper of gunpowder, close enough to touch. An arrangement no trained apothecary would ever risk by accident. She had come to Sable Combe Manor only to inventory Captain Ezra Truan's belongings before the estate agent's sale. 3 weeks after the cottage hospital dismissed her for a dosing error that had never been hers to begin with. Without a character reference, she had no other work waiting. Then the agent's letter arrived. Captain Truan had left her the manor itself, cliffside land and all, over his own grand-nephew. She assumed it was a clerical mistake until she stood again in that dispensary and noticed the cabinet door was hung backward, opening into a wall that should not have had room behind it. The dangerous bottles were not carelessness. They were a message, arranged by someone who expected a trained eye to read them like a dosage chart. Susanna had spent her whole career being told to follow other people's instructions exactly. This time, for the first time, someone had left instructions meant only for her. Mr. Sowden, the estate agent, had read her the letter standing in the manor's cold hall, his hat still in his hand, as though the news embarrassed him too much to sit down for it. "The captain's solicitor confirms it's properly drawn," he said. "Witnessed the week before he died. Mr. Pentreath contests it, of course. Family generally does. Mr. Pentreath being the grand-nephew, Aubrey Pentreath. His people keep the chemist's shop at Bideford. Pentreath and Sons." Sowden said the name, the way a man says a fact he expects to matter later, without explaining why. "He's already written twice asking when the sale proceeds." "I'd not tell him you mean to keep the place. Not until your own solicitors looked at the papers." The cottage hospital dismissal still sat raw enough that she avoided thinking of it directly when she could help it. An administrator had transposed a figure on a dosage slip, a simple clerical slip anyone might make. And when the patient recovered without incident, the mistake would have gone unremarked forever. It was only when the same administrator, questioned by the board, pointed to her signature on the ward record instead of his own, that the story changed shape entirely. By then, no one troubled to ask which hand had actually written the wrong number down. She had met Captain Truan only once before, 18 months earlier, when he brought a sea chest of old ship's medical stores to the cottage hospital dispensary for her to sort and value. Most surgeons sent such chests to be thrown out unexamined. He had stood over her for 2 hours while she worked, asking nothing, watching everything. At the end of it, he had said only that she had a rare kind of eye, and thanked her for the use of it. She had not thought of him again until his solicitor's letter arrived with her name spelled correctly, which surprised her more than the inheritance itself. The dispensary sat at the end of the manor's north passage, a narrow room built into the thickness of the cliffside wall. It stood shelved floor to ceiling with the ordinary stock of a house that had once kept its own medicines. She had inventoried it properly on her first visit, cataloging bottle by bottle in the ledger Sowden provided, and had found nothing then but dust and expired tincture. It was only on her second visit, alone, that she noticed what her first pass had missed. The oil of vitriol and the gunpowder sat exactly where a careless housemaid might have set them down together without thinking. No apothecary who had trained a single week would ever shelve them so. She counted along the row again, slower this time, reading the shelf the way she had once been taught to read a dosage chart, left to right, worst consequence to least. Every dangerous pairing on that shelf pointed, in sequence, toward the same cabinet at the passage end, a plain oak case she had listed in her ledger as containing surgical dressings and nothing more. She had not opened it fully on her first pass. She had only glanced inside, noted linen and bandage roll, and moved on. She opened it again now, all the way, and pulled the door past its ordinary stop. It kept swinging. A cabinet door should have met the frame and held there. Instead, this one continued outward, on a hinge reset to travel the wrong direction entirely. Behind it, where solid cliff wall should have stood, a narrow gap opened into darkness, and with it came the faint, cold smell of the sea. Susanna stood with one hand still on the door, the other pressed flat against the frame to steady herself. Whoever had arranged that shelf had known exactly what kind of person would eventually stand where she now stood, reading danger in the careful order of ordinary bottles. She had spent her whole working life being handed someone else's instructions and told to follow them without question. For the first time in that life, she understood that a set of instructions had been left for her alone, and that no one else who might have inherited this house would have known how to read them. She did not go through the gap that first evening. The light was failing, and she had learned enough in one afternoon to know she wanted a lamp and a clear head before she went further into a hole in a cliffside wall. She pulled the cabinet shut, latched it as best the reversed hinge allowed, and went to find whoever still kept the house. Mrs. Ivy Pascoe had cooked and cleaned for Captain Trewin for 11 years and had stayed on unpaid since his death because, she said, somebody had to keep the damp off the good furniture. She was a broad, tired woman with flour still on her apron from bread she had made for no one in particular. She looked at Susanna the way a person looks at news they have already half guessed. "You're the one he left it to," she said. "Thought it might be. He spoke of you, the once, after that chest business. Said you'd not miss a thing." Susanna asked what else the captain had said. Mrs. Pascoe only shook her head. "He was not a man given to explaining himself," she said. "Not about the house, and not about his sister. Whatever he had wanted known, he had likely arranged to say in his own way, rather than through her. His sister, Miss Judith, dead 8 years now, kept the dispensary herself, back when there was one worth keeping. Half the coast came up that passage for her physic before the new doctor set up at Ashcombe Ford. Mrs. Pascoe set a kettle on the range with more force than the task required. Stopped all at once, though. Whole dispensary shut up within the month she died, and the captain never let a soul touch it after. The village below had already heard, by the time she walked down for candles the next morning. The baker's boy stared past her shoulder rather than meet her eye. 2 fishermen mending nets on the wall fell silent as she passed, then took up their talk again once she had gone a dozen yards further on. Ashcombe Ford had followed the captain's death, and the estate's disposal closely enough, it seemed, that a dismissed nurse inheriting a cliffside manor made better talk than either fact could alone. The manor itself needed more than a dispensary put right. Salt damp had crept into the west rooms. The roof over the old stable block had come down in a winter gale 2 years past and never been repaired. The account book Sowden left her showed debts against the estate, debts that would want careful managing if she meant to keep the place at all. She had arrived with 1 trunk and the clothes on her back, dismissed from her last position without severance or reference, doing the sums by candlelight that night. She understood that Sable Combe Manor was not a fortune so much as a very large, very cold obligation. She spent the second day walking the grounds properly, cataloging the outbuildings the way she had cataloged the dispensary, out of the same habit that made an unread room feel like an unfinished task. The stable block's collapsed roof had let 2 winters of rain into the loft above the old tack room, and the kitchen garden had gone to bramble past all rescuing before spring. Only the dispensary passage, she noted, walking back toward the house in the last of the daylight, showed no sign of the neglect that had settled over everything else the captain once owned. Aubrey Pentreath's first letter reached her within the week, forwarded from Sowden's office, correct in every point of address and courteous in every line, which somehow made it harder to read than an open threat would have been. He wrote that he did not doubt her claim was properly witnessed. He hoped she would consider, all the same, that a woman recently dismissed from a hospital position might find the upkeep of a cliffside estate considerably beyond her means. His family would be glad to make her an offer that spared her the burden, he said. She wrote back only that she had not yet decided what the house was worth to her, and that she would write again once she had. Mrs. Pascoe, reading over her shoulder without being asked, snorted at the word burden. His family's chemist shop bought this whole coast its remedies for 30 years, she said. Funny sort of burden, A house that sat empty and never cost them a farthing until you turned up to claim it. You don't care for the Pentreaths. I buried my own son on one of their remedies 2 winters back, Mrs. Pascoe said, and did not say anything further. She stood a long moment with her hand flat on the table before she went back to the bread. Susanna did not press her that night. She wrote the name down anyway. In the same small notebook where she had begun, out of long habit, to record everything about this house that did not yet make sense. Aubrey Pentreath came in person 8 days later, driving himself up the coast road in a trap too smart for the ruts it had to cross. He was younger than Susanna expected, perhaps 30, dressed with the particular neatness of a man who wanted to be taken for older than he was. He asked to see the house before he said anything else, and she walked him through it herself rather than let him wander unwatched. "You understand the position," he said, standing in the drawing room with its damp-stained ceiling. "My great-uncle was not entirely himself in his final months. Grief does strange things to a man's judgment." Grief. Over what? His sister's death. He never recovered it properly. Some men don't. Aubrey said it smoothly, a line rehearsed enough that it slid past without catching on anything true. "I don't say this to distress you, Miss Locke. I say it because a court will hear it, if this goes to a court. And I'd rather spare us both the expense." Before they reached the dispensary, he paused in the passage, running one gloved finger along the damp-marked wall as though testing how far the rot had traveled. "You'll want a surveyor's opinion before winter," he said. "This whole wing will want more than paint." She said nothing to that, and he did not press it further. She led him to the dispensary next, though she did not open the cabinet in front of him. He stood in the doorway rather than enter, glancing along the shelves with an attention that seemed too careful for idle curiosity. "Nothing kept here now, I take it," he said. "Old stock. Nothing of use. My family would be glad to clear it properly, if you like. There's a certain liability in keeping dangerous substances in an unlicensed house." He said this looking directly at the oil of vitriol on its shelf, and for a moment she thought he might ask outright how it came to sit beside gunpowder. He did not. He only noted, in the same even voice, that the offer his solicitor had already written to hers remained open, generous, and unlikely to improve with delay. He glanced once more toward the dispensary shelves before he spoke again, as though counting something there he did not care to name aloud. "You inventoried the whole house. I understand. Every room, every cupboard. That was the agreement with Mr. Sowden. A full valuation before any sale. Thorough of you." He said it without warmth, the compliment sitting oddly beside the tightness in his jaw. "I haven't decided the house is for sale," she said. "Then perhaps you'd consider what it will cost you to keep it. The roof alone. The rates. A woman on her own, without means." He glanced at her ledger, open on the hall table where Sowden had left it. "I don't say that unkindly." "You say a great many things you don't mean unkindly," Susanna said. She showed him to the door herself, rather than ring for Mrs. Pascoe, unwilling to let the housekeeper hear whatever else he might say once he thought himself unobserved. He left without pressing further, which unsettled her more than an argument would have. A man certain of winning did not generally need to threaten. She watched his trap go down the coast road until the dust settled, and then she went straight to the dispensary, lit 2 lamps instead of 1, and pulled the cabinet door past its stop. The gap beyond was narrow enough that she had to turn sideways to pass through it, the rock close on both shoulders. The air here was cold and faintly mineral, nothing like the damp of the house behind her. A short passage, perhaps 8 feet, opened into a chamber, cut into the cliff itself. It was dry in a way the whole rest of the manor was not, ventilated by some channel she could not immediately see but could feel. A slow, steady draft, moving past her ankles toward the sea. She held her lamp higher. Shelving lined one wall, a workbench the other, both furred with 8 years of undisturbed dust. Beyond them, stacked in careful order exactly as a trained hand would have left it, stood the unmistakable apparatus of a working dispensary. It had never actually stopped being one. It had only stopped being seen. Susanna stood in the doorway. A long moment. The passage's cold air moving past her, and understood that Aubrey Pentreath's easy offers made a different kind of sense now than they had an hour before. A man did not press so gently, so persistently, for a house he believed held nothing. She did not touch anything that first night beyond what she needed to see it clearly. Old habit again. The same discipline that had kept her employed at 3 different dispensaries before the cottage hospital. Catalog before you disturb. Note the position of a thing before you move it, because position was often half the information a shelf could give you. The workbench held a set of apothecary scales, brass gone dull with salt air. A mortar and pestle stood beside them, stained the deep rust color of some long-ground mineral. A row of ceramic jars stood labeled in a narrow, confident hand she did not yet recognize, but already trusted more than she trusted most living chemists. A small tin box of surgical instruments sat closed at the bench's near corner. Unremarkable, except for its clasp. Like the cabinet door before it, the clasp had been fitted to catch from the wrong side. A detail she would have missed entirely if she had not already learned to expect Judith Trewin's small, deliberate reversals. Above the bench, pinned to a board, hung a chart of symptoms and doses. She recognized it in general shape, though not in particular content, the kind of working reference a dispenser kept close at hand rather than buried in a book. She worked her way along the shelving slowly, lamp in one hand, notebook in the other. She recorded each jar's label and approximate quantity the way she would have inventoried any dispensary handed to her for valuation. Several labels named substances she expected in any coastal medicine store. Others she did not expect at all. Iron filings by the pound. A jar marked simply antidote in the same confident hand, and a second jar half its size marked failed, the ink on that second word noticeably darker, added later than the rest. She found Mrs. Pascoe still awake when she finally climbed back through the passage past midnight. She sat at the kitchen table with a single candle and no work in front of her, as though she had been waiting rather than resting. "You've been in Miss Judith's room," Mrs. Pascoe said. Not a question. There's a whole workshop behind the dispensary cabinet. Scales, jars, a chart of doses. Someone kept working there long after the house stopped needing a dispensary at all. Mrs. Pascoe was quiet a moment, turning her cup though it held nothing. She treated the mine men. Wheel Rouen, up past Ashcombe Ford. Arsenic in the ore dust, something in the roasting that got into the men's lungs and blood both. Miss Judith had a remedy for it, worked out over years, and it worked, whatever the mine's own doctor said about it. My Davy took it 3 winters running, and came through every time. And the fourth winter she was dead. And there wasn't any more of it to be had from her. The mine started buying its remedy from Pentreath and Sons instead. Same name printed on the bottle. Same claims made for it. Davy took it, same as always. Mrs. Pascoe's hand tightened around the cup. It didn't work the 4th winter, nor the 5th. He was gone before the frost broke that year. Susanna sat down across from her without being asked, the notebook still open in her lap, the words antidote and failed sitting side by side in her own hand where she had copied them from the jars. The remedy kept the same name. Did it keep the same recipe? That I couldn't tell you. I only know it stopped working. The year the woman who made it properly stopped being alive to make it. Mrs. Pascoe looked at her directly, for the first time that night. "You've a chemist's eye, Miss Locke, same as the captain always said." "Might be. You can tell me what I never could get a straight answer to from anyone at that shop in Bideford." Susanna closed the notebook, though she did not close the question it held. She had come to this house believing herself the unlikely beneficiary of a stranger's odd generosity. She sat in a cold kitchen past midnight with a grieving housekeeper's hand still shaking around an empty cup. For the first time she understood that Captain Trewin had not chosen her out of sentiment at all. He had chosen the one trade she had, because it was the only trade capable of reading what his sister had left behind. She went back into the chamber alone the next morning, before Mrs. Pascoe had the range lit, carrying the household account book in case she needed to compare hands against the captain's own writing. Daylight did not reach that deep into the cliff, so she worked again by lamp, methodical now rather than merely curious, cataloging what she had only glimpsed the night before. A sea chest sat beneath the workbench, iron-bound, salt-pitted. Its hasp was so eaten through with rust that the padlock came away in her hand still locked, the staple crumbling rather than breaking. Inside sat bound ledgers, 3 of them, and beneath those a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. Beneath the letters, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp sea air, lay 2 glass-stoppered bottles of a pale mixture that had not, remarkably, evaporated or spoiled in 8 years underground. She set the account book beside the ledgers to compare hands, though it proved barely necessary. Judith's writing carried none of her brother's cramped naval economy. Every letter formed with the same unhurried confidence Susanna had already come to recognize from the jar labels above. The first ledger was a patient book, names and dates and doses running back nearly 20 years, each entry in the same confident hand from the jar labels. Susanna recognized several surnames from the village below. Pascoe among them, 3 separate entries for a Davy Pascoe, spanning 3 winters, each one noting improvement, each one closing with the same word, recovered. She turned pages faster, hunting for a 4th entry, and found none. The ledger's last page was dated 8 years back, the same season Mrs. Pascoe had named as the year Judith Trewin died. The letters told the rest more slowly than she wanted them to. Correspondence between Judith Trewin and a Walter Pentreath, Aubrey's father by the dates, began as professional courtesy, a chemist's polite inquiry into her arsenic remedies composition. It soured within a year into something closer to demand. Pentreath wanted the formula for his own shop's stock, offered payment, then a partnership, then simply pressed harder when she refused each in turn. Her draft replies, kept, rather than sent in several cases, insisted the active preparation was costly to make correctly and could not be cheapened without losing its effect entirely. One line, underlined twice in ink gone brown with age, read, "I will not put my name to a bottle that lies about what it contains." The final letter in the bundle came from Pentreath, dated some months after Judith's death. It was addressed not to her but to Captain Trewin, offering condolences. In the same paragraph it offered a generous sum for the rights to manufacture her remedy under the Trewin family name, for the good of the mining families who depended on it. A note in the captain's own hand, pinned to the letter's corner, read only, "Refused, and kept for the day someone comes who can read what she left." Susanna uncorked one of the 2 bottles carefully. The mixture inside was cloudy, faintly rust-colored, with a mineral smell she associated, from her hospital training, with preparations built around hydrated iron. She set it beside the second bottle, unlabeled but for a scrap of paper reading Pentreath's current stock. Without yet being able to prove it in a way a coroner would accept, she understood that whatever the second bottle contained, it very likely was not what its label promised. Beneath the letters, at the very bottom of the chest, lay a smaller notebook bound in plain calfskin. Its pages held sketches rather than words, careful diagrams of apparatus and of the ventilation channel itself, dated across several years as though its maker had refined the workshop's design the way another woman might refine a recipe. Susanna recognized in the drawings the same channel she had felt cold air moving through only the night before. It was marked here with measurements and a note about tide levels she did not yet fully understand. She sat on the cold stone floor of the chamber a long while, the ledger open across her knees, the letters spread around her in the lamp's small circle of light. Not a secret shameful enough to bury, though it may have begun as that too, when Judith was alive and simply protecting her own work from a man who wanted it cheapened. A record. It was proof that a woman's careful, costly remedy had actually worked, for as long as she lived to make it properly. It had stopped working the exact year someone else began selling it under her family's name instead. Aubrey Pentreath returned 3 days later, this time with his father. Walter Pentreath was a heavier, grayer version of his son, dressed in the same careful neatness, and he did not wait to be shown the house before he came to the point of his visit. Susanna had seen him coming from the dispensary window and had time only to wrap the ledger and letters in oilcloth and push them back into the sea chest before Mrs. Pascoe let the two men in. Her hands were still cold from the chamber's stone floor when she took her seat across from them, and she kept them folded in her lap, so neither Pentreath would see them shake. "My son tells me you've had time to consider our offer," Walter said. They were seated in the drawing room by then, his hat balanced on his knee, with the careful economy of a man who did not intend to stay long. "I'll be direct, Miss Locke, since directness generally saves everyone trouble. Whatever you've found in that old dispensary, I'd be glad to purchase it from you outright, papers and all, along with the house." "What do you imagine I've found?" "Family papers. Miss Trewin kept a great many private things, some of them concerning our shop's early history. A layperson reading old figures without proper context might draw an alarming conclusion that isn't warranted." He set an envelope on the table between them, thick enough that she did not need to open it to guess its weight. "This would resolve your difficulties considerably. Mining families need remedies they can trust, Miss Locke, and a public quarrel over old formulas serves no one. Least of all them." She looked at the envelope a long moment. It would clear the estate's debts twice over, repair the stable roof, buy her a life that did not depend on the goodwill of a grand-nephew who wanted her gone. She thought of the underlined line in Judith's own hand. "I will not put my name to a bottle that lies about what it contains." "I don't believe the formula changed for good reason, Mr. Pentreath," she said. "I believe it changed because the true one cost more to make than the false one." A long silence followed, filled only by the ordinary sounds of the house, a gull, somewhere above the chimney, Mrs. Pascoe's footsteps crossing the kitchen floor overhead. Walter's expression did not move, though something in his stillness sharpened, the same careful stillness she had seen in his son. "That's a serious accusation to make without proof. I have her ledger. I have your letters to her, and hers to you, kept rather than sent. I don't think I lack for proof so much as time to use it properly." Aubrey spoke for the first time since entering, quieter than his father, almost gentle. "You dismissed a hospital over one disputed dose, Miss Locke, through no fault of your own, you say. Consider how a coroner's jury might receive a woman with that history, making accusations against a respected chemist's firm. Consider what it might cost you to be disbelieved twice. It landed exactly where he intended it to land. She had spent 3 weeks unable to find work because one hospital administrator's carelessness had been quietly folded into her own record instead of his. She knew precisely how little a wronged woman's word weighed against an established name, and Aubrey knew she knew it. Aubrey glanced at his father, some unspoken question passing between them, before he spoke again, gentler still. "We only mean to spare you a difficult season, Miss Locke. Winter on this coast is hard enough without a fight added to it. Then I'd best make certain I'm not disbelieved," she said, and did not trust her voice to say more. Walter Pentreath left the envelope on the table when he rose to go. Unwilling, it seemed, to carry the offer back out the door with him unaccepted. It sat there exactly as his own letters had once sat on Judith's table, years before. Watching father and son walk back to their trap, Susanna understood that she was not the first Trewin dispensary keeper this family had tried to buy rather than answer honestly. The following morning she rode into Ashcombe Ford, laid the sealed envelope on Mr. Kiddo's desk, and told him plainly that she wanted it kept, unopened, until someone in authority asked what it contained. A notice reached her 2 mornings later from the parish clerk's office, forwarded by Mr. Kiddo with a brief covering note that did little to soften it. A complaint had been lodged, unsigned but understood by everyone who read it, to have come from a respected local firm, regarding dangerous chemicals kept in an unsupervised private dwelling. A county inspector would attend Sable Combe Manor within the week to assess whether the materials required seizure and disposal under the public safety statute. Susanna read it standing in the hall, still in her coat from the walk to the post office, and understood before she reached the second paragraph that Aubrey Pentreath had not taken her refusal quietly. A seizure order would empty the chamber of everything in it. Ledger, letters, and bottled remedy alike. Under the perfectly reasonable cover of a housewife's safety. She went to the chamber first, before she had even taken off her coat, and found the sea chest exactly as she had left it, the ledger and letters still wrapped inside. For one relieved moment she believed the notice was the worst news the day held. Then she noticed the passage air, colder and saltier than it should have been even at low tide. She followed it to the chamber's outer end. The ventilation channel she had assumed too narrow for anything larger than a draft. It had been widened, scraped raw at its edges, as though someone had worked a crowbar against soft rock rather than against the cabinet door. The workbench had been swept clean across its whole length, jars pushed to the floor and left where they shattered rather than carried off. Both bottles of Judith's finished remedy lay smashed against the stone, their contents soaked into the dust past saving. In the small space where a fire might be laid, someone had struck matches and dropped them unlit. 3 or 4 scattered black-headed sticks. It looked as though they had considered burning what they could not carry away, and thought better of it, or been interrupted before they finished. Later, walking the shore path in the last of the light, she went looking for whatever trace the tide had not yet erased. The sand near the cut's mouth had already smoothed over where anyone might have climbed. Wedged between 2 rocks, she found a clay pipe, still faintly warm to the touch, its bowl not yet cold enough to have lain there long. Mrs. Pascoe found her there near dusk and went pale at the broken glass, crossing herself in a way Susanna had not seen her do before. "Nobody came through the house," she said. "I'd have heard the cabinet. Must have come up from the shore path, through the old smuggler's cut below the cliff. Half the coast knows it's there. Fewer know it comes up this close to the house. Who would know that? Anyone who fished this shore as a boy. Mr. Aubrey used to. Summers. Before his father moved the family to Bideford proper. Mrs. Pascoe's face answered the rest of the question before her words caught up to it. Wouldn't put it past him to remember a boy's shortcut, grown or not. She spent an hour before dark, setting the workbench back in some order, sweeping shattered glass into a dustpan, and standing the surviving jars upright where they belonged. A few had cracked without breaking outright, their contents drying along the seams. And these she set aside separately, unwilling to trust them, until she knew what had spilled and what had merely settled. It was slow, deliberate work, the kind she found steadying precisely because it asked nothing of her except attention. Mr. Kiddo's reply to the inspection notice arrived the following morning, apologetic in the manner of a solicitor delivering news he could not improve. He could request a delay, he wrote, but the complaint cited urgency on safety grounds. A lay solicitor could not easily dispute that without an expert witness of his own, one she had neither the time nor the money to secure before the inspector's visit. He added that Pentreath and Sons had separately filed a fresh challenge to the will itself, citing the captain's confused final months. The probate court would likely hear the matter within the same fortnight, regardless of what the inspector decided about the chamber. Susanna stood among the broken glass with 2 deadlines closing on her at once, an inspection that could empty the chamber of its proof, and a probate hearing that could take the house along with it. Whoever had come up through the smuggler's cut had not found the sea chest. That much still stood between her and losing everything twice over. Whatever she meant to prove, though, she understood she would have to prove it in the days remaining before the inspector arrived, and not a day past that. She went to Ashcombe Ford herself the next morning, not to the inspector's office, but to Peter Yeo. He was an apprentice at the town's one chemist shop, trained one summer under the same hospital surgeon who had later dismissed her. He was the only person in 3 parishes she trusted to run a proper test. Without asking questions she could not yet answer honestly. He had grown thinner since she last saw him, his apron ink-stained at the pocket where he kept his pencil, and he glanced twice toward the shop's front window before he led her through to the back counter. "I need to know what's actually in this," she said, setting the unlabeled bottle marked Pentreath's current stock on his counter. Beside it, she set the second, older bottle from Judith's chest. Its contents had survived the broken pair only because she had thought, at the last moment, to keep one in her coat pocket rather than leave both in the chamber. He cleared a space on the crowded back counter, pushing aside a rack of drying flasks. He set out 2 clean dishes with the unhurried care of someone who had learned early that a rush test told you nothing worth trusting. Peter ran the iron test first, the simplest one available to him, a few drops of each mixture against a reagent that turned unmistakably dark with a true hydrated iron preparation. Against the newer bottle it stayed pale and weak, barely colored at all. He ran it twice on each bottle before he trusted the result enough to speak. "The old one's a proper preparation," he said. "Strong, correctly made, whatever else it is. The new one's mostly chalk and water, with just enough iron in it to pass a careless glance. I couldn't swear to the exact recipe without more time, but I'd stake my apprenticeship that whoever's selling this current bottle as a treatment for arsenic exposure is selling something that does almost nothing at all." It was not proof by itself. One apprentice's reagent test against a bottle with no clear provenance. Set beside the ledger and the letters, though, the test finally made a coherent story out of scraps she had been carrying separately for a fortnight. Judith Trewin had spent nearly 20 years perfecting a genuine remedy for the mine dust poisoning that killed or crippled half the men who worked Wheel Ruan long enough. She had refused, in writing, to let Walter Pentreath cheapen it for wider sale. After her death, no one remained who knew the true recipe or cared enough to insist on it. Pentreath and Sons had continued selling a bottle under her family's trusted name that could not have treated anything at all. "There's an inquest at Ashcombe Ford next week," Peter added, wrapping both bottles carefully before he handed them back. "Young fellow off the Wheel Ruan account, Nick Runnels, not 22, took sick same as the others. Took the remedy same as always, and didn't come through it. His mother's asking questions nobody at the mine office wants to answer." She walked to the window and back once, turning the shape of the case over in her mind before she trusted herself to ask him the harder question. Susanna asked, carefully, whether Peter would put his test results into a written statement and stand behind them under his own name if the coroner asked. He hesitated only briefly. An apprentice's whole future weighed for a moment against a stranger's dead son. Then he said he would, on the condition that he could repeat the test once more, properly witnessed, before he swore to anything in a public room. Outside, the town had gone about its ordinary business. Carts and errands, and a knot of children chasing a hoop past the chemist's window, entirely unaware that the bottle on every 3rd shelf in the county might soon be proven worthless. She rode back to Sable Combe, with both bottles wrapped in her coat and the ledger's proof settling, finally, into a shape a coroner's jury might actually be made to see. Nick Runnels had weighed, by his mother's own account given to Peter, barely 9 stone, weakened already by a hard winter's work. He was exactly the kind of man a true remedy might have saved, and a false one, dressed up in a trusted name, could do nothing for it all. The inquest room at Ashcombe Ford's Inn was fuller than the coroner likely expected for a mine laborer's death. Word had traveled along the coast that the new mistress of Sable Combe Manor meant to speak. The coroner opened proceedings addressing the jury rather than the room, reading the surgeon's report on Nick Runnels's death, arsenic-related lung failure, nothing in the medical evidence to suggest foul play. He had nearly moved to close the inquiry when Mr. Kiddo rose and asked formally to enter further evidence relevant to the deceased's treatment. She began with the bottles rather than the papers, setting the old preparation and the current stock side by side on the coroner's own table, where the jury needed only their eyes to see the difference in color. Only then did she open the ledger, to the page recording Davy Pascoe's 3 recoveries under Judith Truan's original remedy. Her narrow, confident hand was unmistakable against the household accounts, which Kiddo had already had authenticated by a local bank clerk who recognized it from old estate correspondence. The letters came last. Walter Pentreath's early requests, his later pressure, Judith's refusal written plainly in her own words. Nick Runnels took the remedy sold under this label, she said, setting the newer bottle where the jury could see it, believing it to be the same treatment that saved men on this coast for 20 years. It was not the same treatment. It had almost none of the active preparation that made the original effective, and the woman who could have told anyone that fact has been dead 8 years. The room had gone very quiet by then, quiet enough that Susanna could hear the coroner's clerk's pen scratching against paper somewhere behind the table. Walter Pentreath rose before the coroner could recognize him, his composure from the drawing room considerably reduced. "This is a private matter of family formula, dressed up as inquest evidence. My firm has sold that remedy in good faith for years. Nothing in old letters changes the current product's composition. Then perhaps Mr. Pentreath can explain," the coroner said, setting down the surgeon's report with a deliberateness that suggested he had already stopped believing him. "Why did an apprentice chemist test this morning find almost no active preparation in a bottle purchased from his own shop counter 3 days ago?" Peter Yeo gave his account next, steady despite his obvious nerves, describing the reagent test and its result without claiming more chemical certainty than he possessed. He held firm under Walter's sharp questioning on the facts he had actually observed. Mrs. Pascoe followed, reading from a written statement Kiddo had helped her prepare, naming her son's 3 recoveries and his final winter. When the coroner asked directly, she named the year the remedy her son trusted had stopped being made by the woman who first perfected it. A murmur ran through the public benches when the coroner read the analyst's summons into the record, loud enough that he rapped his gavel once before, allowing Mr. Kiddo to continue. Aubrey sat near the back, where his father had stood at Susanna's own reading of the will, his hands folded tightly in his lap, offering nothing further to the proceedings. Whatever argument the family meant to make, it seemed, had ended the moment the analyst's name entered the record. The coroner adjourned briefly to confer with the jury's foreman and the county's own analyst, sent for that morning once word of the complaint reached his office. When the inquiry resumed, he addressed Susanna directly for the first time. She understood, before he finished his opening sentence, that the outcome was already settled in the room's collective mind, if not yet in law. The jury returned a verdict of death by misadventure. A formal rider recommended the county's analyst examine Pentreath and Sons' current remedy stock before it was sold to another mining family under a dead woman's trusted name. Mrs. Runnels, seated in the front row throughout, did not speak once during the whole proceeding, but she reached across and took Mrs. Pascoe's hand the moment the verdict was read. And the 2 women sat that way a long moment after the room had begun to empty around them. Walter Pentreath left before the session fully closed, his own solicitor already murmuring urgently at his elbow. Aubrey lingered by the door rather than follow him straight out, watching the room empty around the table, where the 2 bottles still stood side by side. When Susanna finally gathered them into her bag, he spoke to her for the first time since his father's visit, low enough that only she heard it. "She'd have hated what this became," he said, and left before Susanna could decide whether he meant Judith or something closer to home. The probate challenge lapsed within a fortnight. Aubrey's own solicitor advised him, according to what Mr. Kiddo later heard secondhand, that pressing a claim of the captain's confused judgment would invite exactly the kind of scrutiny the inquest verdict had already opened. A contested will was a poor vehicle, he said, for a family hoping to keep its analyst's report quiet. The seizure notice against the dispensary's contents was withdrawn the same week, the inspector's office apparently satisfied that a licensed, properly supervised premises presented no public danger after all. The county analyst's examination of Pentreath and Sons' remedy stock took most of the following month and confirmed, in language considerably drier than the inquest rooms, what Peter Yo's reagent test had already shown. Walter Pentreath surrendered the shop's license to compound and sell the preparation rather than face a formal hearing before the trade's own governing body. Aubrey, according to Mrs. Pascoe's sources in Bideford, left his father's business within the year and was said to have taken a clerking position somewhere inland, well away from any counter that sold medicine. Mr. Sowden called that spring to settle the last of the estate's paperwork. He remarked, without being asked, that Sable Combe Manor had gone from the least promising property on his books to the one he was most often asked about by strangers passing through Ashcombe Ford. Susanna told him only that she had not changed anything the house did not already want changed. Nobody else in the county had troubled to put Judith Truan's name back where it belonged. So Susanna did it herself. She had the old patient ledger rebound rather than filed away, its spine repaired by a Bideford bookbinder, and kept it on the workbench in the chamber rather than locked in the sea chest. The chamber itself she left much as she found it. The ventilation channel widened by the intruder's crowbar she had sealed properly this time, and the cabinet door's reversed hinge she kept exactly as it was. She saw no reason to make it swing the ordinary way, when the wrong way had done its work for 8 years, and might yet be needed to prove something again. She used what remained of Mr. Kiddo's settled costs to repair the stable roof before the worst of the winter gales. She set Mrs. Pascoe's wages right, for every month unpaid since the captain's death. What was left, she put toward reopening the dispensary properly, licensed this time under her own name. Its scales were recalibrated, its jars relabeled in her own steady hand beside Judith's original ones, wherever the old labels could still be read. She kept the mortar and pestle-stained rust red from long use. On his afternoons free from the Ashcombe Ford shop, she taught Peter Yo how Judith's preparation was properly made. Slow and costly exactly as the letters had always insisted it must be, rather than cut for speed or profit. He came twice a month at first, then weekly, staying later each visit than the last. Mrs. Runnels came up from the village that same spring to thank her properly. Standing awkward in the hall with a basket of eggs, she insisted on leaving despite Susanna's protests. She said only that it helped. A little. Knowing her boy's death had changed something for the men still working the ore. Mrs. Pascoe stayed on at the manor through the following spring and showed no sign of leaving after. She had buried one employer already, she said, and did not intend to abandon the next one, to a house this size, on her own. She took to sitting in the dispensary doorway most afternoons with her mending, close enough to see who came up the passage. She told anyone who asked that she had known, the moment Susanna first climbed through that cabinet gap, exactly what kind of tenant this house had been waiting for. On a bright cold morning that winter, word came up from Wheel Ruan that a man newly sick from the ore dust wanted the old Truan remedy. He had heard from another miner that the real preparation was being made again at the manor, and not merely sold under its name. Susanna weighed the ingredients herself at the workbench, checking the scale twice against the figures in Judith's ledger before she trusted the measure, and corked the finished bottle with her own hand. She set it on the shelf beside the empty space where its predecessor had stood untouched for 8 years. Closing the ledger for the day, she thought that some things were worth making exactly as difficult and exact as they had always needed to be, rather than easy enough to sell.